Chapter 42 Ruoro's Name Release. Fan Xian sat down, ignoring this guy and instead letting his sister sit down first, before he smiled and asked, "Who is this gentleman?" He naturally guessed which character this little fatty was, but deliberately did not point it out. "I am Fan Xizhe, the Fan family's youngest master." The fat teenager looked at him twice and grunted, "So you're that bastard." There was a faint sound beside his ear, and Fan Xian's afterglow went to look at Lu unexpectedly. Lu had long since disappeared without a reason, not knowing where he had gone, and it seemed that he was deliberately letting his own son make some noise to break Fan Xian's calming efforts. Anyway, if something unseemly happens later, he can excuse himself for being a young man who doesn't know much about the world. A trace of weird smile floated on the corners of Fan Xian's lips. He knew in Tanyu Port that this legitimate young master in the Kyoto mansion has a big temper and has always been brutal for the sake of his father. In order to avoid the future of the Fan mansion because of this kid to offend the real power and nobility and end up in a tragic situation, Fan Xian decided to pull out the redundancy to educate personally about this younger brother. But what came next was completely out of his expectations. An icy voice rang out, but it came from Fan Ruoro's thin lips. "Stretch out your hand." After saying these words, Miss Fan took out the long ruler from under the table. "Why?" Fan Xizhe grunted. His face looked very scared, but he still obediently stretched out his hand. With two slaps, two red marks appeared on Fan Xizhe's hand, and tears began to bubble out of his eyes, but he still gritted his teeth and endured them, cursing, "Sis, for an outsider." The word outsider was not finished. Fan Ruoro had already, without any expression, hit the little fat man's hand with two more heavy swipes of the ruler. Only then did Fan Xian realize that the indifference between his sister's brows was indeed very oppressive in the eyes of the average person. First, you can't call your brother by his first name. Second, you must understand our family's status and not say those bastard words. Third, if you disrespect your elder brother, you will naturally receive a punishment. Fan Ruoro spoke indifferently, and the way she held the ruler in her hand reminded Fan Xian of those kindergarten ants who were soft and lovely on the surface, but in reality were incredibly vicious. Fan Xizhe gave Fan Xian a fierce stare, and with her mouth flattened, she ran towards the backyard. "Every time he cries, he goes to his mom." Fan Ruoro sighed. "I'm curious as to which two words Xizhe is. Thoughts stagnate like a pig and crosses the road to stay rutted. It's funny to see such an elegantly trained name being interpreted by my sister into these two words. Which is not as funny as the stubborn jokes told by brother. Why can you beat people with a ruler in your hand? Father gave me the authority to discipline him. That seems a little different from my original analysis of the world. Is that about male power? Well, there's also the issue of power distribution in the families back home. At the moment it seems like I've gained a little bit of power. But don't forget that this power of yours is completely dependent on that man's likes and dislikes. And don't forget, brother, that the man you speak of is our father." The question and answer session came to a grinding halt, and Fan Xian and Fan Ruoro looked at each other and smiled, very pleasantly. At this time, there were no outsiders present, and Fan Ruoro was no longer as self-possessed as she had been earlier, and smiled with a spreading smile that made it clear that her heart was happy and could not be suppressed. Fan Xian is also the same, in this world, probably only often letters to and from the sister, is to be able to really use some kind of logic that only they can adapt to talk to the object. Moreover, when they first started to write to each other, Fan Ruoro was still young, so to a certain extent, Fan Ruoro's view of the world and life had been greatly influenced by Fan Xian's subtle influence. The two of them had not seen each other for 10 years, so they should have been somewhat unfamiliar with each other, but the previous conversation, in which only the two of them could feel the flavor, had quickly brought them closer together, as if the older brother, younger sister, sitting in front of them hadn't been separated for 10 years, but was a good friend who got along with him every day in the courtyard and studied side by side. In this kind of relationship, Fan Ruoro viewed Fan Xian as a teacher, while Fan Xian viewed his sister as a student or a junior, and this mentality was very subtle. Fan Xian smiled as he looked at her and whispered, seeing that you're in the mansion right now, you seem to be doing well, so I've been worrying a bit too much. Fan Ruo lowered her head and whispered, all thanks to brother's idea. Oh? Fan Xian smiled shyly. Could it be that the romance bridge he wrote about his previous life could really work? It was just not a good idea to ask this directly. Recently, Lu has been more peaceful. Fan Ruo said lightly. She called her Aunt Lu. Even if there was only Fan Xian and her two in the hall at this time, she still seemed very cold. Fan Xian deliberated a bit before saying, although I'm far away from Tanyu State, I also know that the Lu family has an extremely high status in the capital, so don't treat her too lightly. Won't. Fan Ruo lowered her eyelids, her eyelashes resting on her fair skin, very beautiful. Fan Xian smiled as he looked at her, realizing that it was indeed a blessing to find someone who could know oneself in a world, even though this person was like being taught by oneself. He softly said, did you receive my letter? Fan Ruo smiled. The frost on her face had long since disappeared without a trace. When I saw that letter in my room the night before last, I was startled and thought it was coming from a bad person. But then I saw the handwriting on the letter and realized it was you. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders, thinking that with Wu Zhu's ability, being a letter carrier was indeed somewhat condescending. Still no one in the hall came in to disturb the two's talk, which Fan Xian was satisfied with. He took a sip of tea and asked with a straight face, you probably don't know the reason why I entered the capital this time. Fan Ruo lifted her face and looked at her brother with a smile or not. Fan Xian was somewhat embarrassed by her look, and said inarticulately, what's wrong? A slightly flirtatious sigh rang out, and the little girl smiled and said, the reason you went to the capital is probably known to many people, and I believe that the sons and daughters of the prestigious families in Kyoto are all very curious about how much of a chance the illegitimate son of the Sananbo has of succeeding in that matter this time he went to the capital. Ah? Fan Xian was slightly shocked and asked, I've always thought that my father letting me enter the capital was a very secretive matter. Do many people know? But I believe that not many people in Kyoto know who I am, so how could anyone be curious about me? Because you went into the capital this time to prepare for your marriage. Fan Ruo smiled. The woman that father is preparing for you to marry is very famous. Fan Xian frowned slightly, although he didn't see himself marrying the other party, but in any case, he was still concerned about what kind of character the woman he might marry was, and asked, do you know that lady? My future sister-in-law is the Lin family's young lady. The pupils of Fan Ruo's eyes flashed with an imperceptible luster. Not only do I know her, I believe that everyone in the entire Kyoto knows her. Which Lin family? Why is that woman so famous? Fan Xian raised an eyebrow. Brother, although you've always been far away in Tanyu, I know that the paper-printed object that was run in the palace, Grandma should have a copy of it there as well. Fan Ruo smiled. Fan Xian recalled, slapped his forehead, and suddenly realized, could it be that the Lin family is Chancellor Lin Ruofu's family? That young lady is the protagonist of the Chancellor's illegitimate daughter incident that was so heated some time ago?